Hello and welcome to Political Dharma with Alan Zundel. In this video, I'm going to be explaining why the United States has a two-party system and what we can do about it. I'm going to point towards the institution of the presidency of the United States as the prime factor in leading toward a two-party system, which is rather ironic because sometimes people who are discussing the problems of parties in the United States will point back to George Washington, our first president under the U.S. Constitution, and his farewell address in which he warned of the effects of the spirit of party, as he put it. He did this in his farewell address that he gave to the nation in 1796 as he ended his second administration and on the verge of the election of a new president because he wasn't going to run for a third term. This is well worth looking up online because it's a very brief and easy to read document, and it may have surprising resonance for the political situation that we find ourselves in today. Let's look down into about the middle of his speech and read some of the highlighted parts that I have here. First of all, he talks about the danger of parties, and he's calling for national unity and rejection of the spirit of party, as he calls it. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. And then further down in the text, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge natural to party dissension, is itself a frightful despotism. So he's predicting that as different parties try to gain the advantage over each other, each time one gains power, it will try to suppress the other, resulting in a kind of dictatorship or oppression. Again, the disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose and the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. Washington is predicting that the citizens of the United States will get sick and tired of the constant bickering and attempts of the two parties to try to gain the advantage over each other, and to have some peace in the country, they will turn to somebody they see as a unifying leader and give them dictatorial powers to suppress this kind of factionalization. So he's worrying about how parties will lead to dictatorship. And a little further on the page I have here, it, meaning the spirit of party, serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. By that he means when people are in office trying to govern, they're going to be distracted by party fighting and find it difficult to make any decisions and act as officials, that it's going to keep them from doing anything in the realm of the politics. As we often see, Congress stalemated in itself between the Republicans and the Democrats, and nothing happens. And he goes on, it agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity one party against another, foments occasional riot and insurrection, which are things that we have seen lately. If you don't want to call it an insurrection, I think at least we can all agree that on January 6th of 2020, we saw a riot. At least you can say that. So he's saying this whole spirit of party leads to the constant fighting between the two parties, one trying to suppress the other, maybe the rising of a dictatorship when the public gets sick of the whole thing, or maybe, people just, tumultuous times and everybody will be unhappy. All right, so that's what Washington is predicting, but my contention is that it was the very institution of the presidency that led to the parties forming. Before the U.S. Constitution and before the administration of George Washington, there was no such thing as a mass political party anywhere in the world, anywhere in history. They started to develop in Washington's time, and that is why he was giving this warning to the public as he was leaving office, because he saw the beginnings of it. And that's why I'm saying it flows naturally from the office of the presidency. Why? Two reasons. First one being that whenever only one person can win in office, that is opposed to a situation where, say, you have a Congress with proportional representation, where you have A lot of parties can win, a lot of people can win office because there's hundreds of offices to be filled, hundreds of seats in the Congress. But if you have only one person winning, there'll be a natural tendency to form coalitions and we'll end up with just two big coalitions. Let me give you an illustration of how that works. All right, let's start off with a situation in which there's an election and there's 5 candidates and they split all the voter support between them. You see the woman with dark hair on the left, she's getting about 13% of the public support. The guy with the dark beard is getting about 18%. The woman with blonde hair is getting 21%. The woman with glasses is getting 23%. And the guy with glasses is getting 25%. So the inevitable outcome of this, if somebody can win who has the most votes as opposed to majority, then it would be the guy with the glasses who has 25%, which is more votes than any of the other candidates. Now, what are the other candidates going to do if they see the election approaching and they know this guy is in the lead? Well, the obvious thing to do is try to make a deal with some other candidate. And if you can find a candidate who has something in common with you and you think your supporters would have issues that they share in common, then you can make some kind of deal to say, well, we can get together and put our votes together. Which one of us can take the lead? And the one who's going to take the lead will promise something to the other so that they also get something out of it. So in this case, the blonde woman allows the guy with the beard to take over her supporters in return for something, taking up her issues maybe, or promising her a position, something like that. And combine their 18% and 21% gives them 39%, which beats the guy in the glasses who would have won with 25%. All right. The guy in the glasses then, he says, well, two can play at that game. I can get the woman with glasses and we'll form the glasses coalition and put our votes together. So if they do that, then one of them will have to drop out. Let's say it's the guy with glasses, leaving the woman with glasses to share both of their sets of supporters, combining the 23% of hers with the 25% of his. She now has 48%. And it is getting closer to just 2 candidates, right? So what is the guy with the beard going to do? He's going to say to the woman with the dark hair, well, is there a way we can combine forces because together we could beat that other woman and try to find something in common with her so that they can again make a deal and bring their supporters together. Now, in that case, they would be doing the same kind of deal that he did earlier with the other woman who dropped out. But what if the woman in dark hair does not want to drop out and combine forces with him? What if she just wants to keep her 13% and go ahead, hoping that her issues will at least get some attention, or she'll do some kind of educational campaign for the voters? Well, you know what I'm talking about here is she ends up being a third party. She is got a minority of the votes, but she doesn't want to share them with somebody else. She doesn't want to drop out of the race so her supporters can go to another candidate. And the thing that the guy with the beard can then do, he has another option, and this comes out of our modern times, is the option of trying to get her kicked off the ballot entirely. I've been pointing out this year in my videos how much the Democratic Party in particular this year has tried to get other candidates off the ballot who they thought their supporters might turn to them if they didn't have that candidate. So this was not true early in the nation's history, but it is true now that control over who gets on the ballot gives that guy with the beard the option of trying to get her out of the race and thus take over the 13% that she had, and in that maneuver end up with a total of 52%, which now beats the woman with the glasses. So we have that dynamic in which, in order to get the most votes to win, you have candidates asking other candidates to drop out in their favor so they can get their supporters, and in return, they will do something for that other candidate who's dropping out. That is the pressure of a one-seat election, that there'll always be an incentive for the candidates to try to find a way to reduce the number of candidates who are the closest ideologically or in terms of policy or in terms of voter support for whatever reason, to get them to drop out and combine forces. So there's a tendency to reduce the number of candidates down to just 2 main candidates with broad support, and anybody else has very little chance of winning if they try to stand outside those coalitions that have a sliver of the vote. That's one thing. Now, it is not necessarily true that this leads to a two-party system, because you could have shifting coalitions from election to election. That is, say that situation that I just explained happens, but in the next election, you have different candidates who are able to find different voters to support them, and you'd have to switch around and make different kinds of deals and find a way to create a new coalition. So you could have from election to election different coalitions and constant bargaining, and that is actually what was happening in the states before the Constitution was written and the presidency was instituted. Let's look at a little history here. Very briefly, is the American Revolution lasted from roughly 1774, depending on when you think hostilities began, to 1783 when the British surrendered. The U.S. Constitution, which created the office of the presidency, was not adopted until 1789. In between, the United States was governed by a document, its first constitution called the Articles of Confederation, in which there was not a president in the form we know now. What it was they had delegates from each state gathered together as a Congress, and they would elect a presiding officer for their meeting and call that the president. But the president didn't have any independent power and was not elected by the voters separately as in our current system with U.S. president. So they were unhappy with the Articles of Confederation, and a number of, even though it lasted through the end of the American Revolution, and some politicians at the national level got together and wrote the Constitution, got it ratified and then adopted, and you had the first election of a president with George Washington in 1789. So why didn't this result in, shifting coalitions after Washington? If you remember your history at all, there's widespread respect for Washington, and that's why they chose him as the first president, because just about everyone regarded him as a symbol of national unity. But when he finished his second administration and was not running again, the question was who was going to replace Washington? And this is part of the reason the party system evolved. Within Washington's cabinet, Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury, and they had very different visions of where the national government should be leading the country. It had to do with the organization of the economy, as is often the case among presidential contenders. Jefferson wanted a more agricultural economy like down south, not only with slave plantations, but with most of the citizens owning some piece of land and being independent, growing their own crops and selling them, and that type of thing. He thought that would be the best way to form independent citizens, whereas Alexander Hamilton wanted to see a wealthy country that was growing all the time and could use its extra wealth to create an army and be strong and not be invaded by other countries. So he was more interested in advancing commercial interests, as in the North, with early factories and banks evolving and those sorts of things. So they had different visions of the country, and Washington already saw them arguing with each other over what kind of policies to institute, and that's what he was warning about. He saw this as factionalization. He thought reasonable people could always come up with with agreement on what the right thing to do was, and that if there was this kind of contention, it must have something to do with personalities or personal ambition, and he just didn't understand how it was developing. Well, what happened was, in the election to replace Washington, this was the election of 1796, and Jefferson was one of the candidates, and John Adams, who had been George Washington's vice president and an ally of Alexander Hamilton, was the other candidate. And what they did is they saw that they needed to get the most votes to win. And in the Electoral College, this is actually, they had to get a majority to win. So they went around to other potential candidates, and especially to the electors in the Electoral College who had been chosen by the states, and try to make deals with them to support their candidacy and build those kind of coalitions that would give one of them the majority over the other. John Adams, in this case, was the winner, but it was very close. You see on this page from Wikipedia that he got 71 electoral votes and Jefferson got 68. That means that Adams became president and Jefferson became vice president under the rules at the time, which they soon changed because you had a president and vice president fighting a lot throughout his administration. So Jefferson put his sights on the next election in 1800, and that one he won. And the way he won it was that he not only tried to talk to electors and get them together to support his candidacy, he started talking to people in the state legislatures, and who in some states were going to pick the electors, and he tried to get them into a coalition with him. And then he went to states where the voters actually chose the electors for the Electoral College, and he talked to the voters, and he tried to identify political clubs that were agitating for greater democracy in the country, for extending the right to vote to more and more people, especially men who didn't have a lot of property, who had been excluded from the franchise in some of the states. So he was going around to voters as well to try to incorporate them into his union. Now, this is the creation of the beginnings of a mass political party, because he got together not only his temporary coalition, but he got together his legislators across the country in different states and voters. And in order to give them all a way of identifying with the same cause, he had to come up with things like names and symbols and party events, rallies and whatnot. And it developed over time into what we know as the modern two-party system. So it was really the presidency in two aspects that created the two-party system. Number one, because only one person could win, there's a pressure for people to combine forces and build larger coalitions to build their to beat their opponents. And the second one was that because it was the presidency, it was representing the whole country, and he had to get electoral support all across the country. He had to find a way to get voters involved in this and get politicians involved in various states and build some sense of identity among them. I don't want to leave you with the impression that Jefferson was traveling around doing all this organizing personally. He had connections with people in the states, colleagues and political allies who were doing the organizing for him. It also was, in his mind, as well as those of most politicians, that it was unseemly to be too ambitious for higher political office. But because travel was slow and difficult, they had to rely on this. But that's also why politics before this time was intensely personal and built on personal networks. The states were smaller geographically, the population was smaller, so when they had elections for even statewide offices like governor or U.S. senator from a state, the coalitions they built were ordinarily around personal networks and political networks and connections between people that had been engaged in politics in one aspect or another. And that's what a national movement like to elect a president had to overcome. The personal networks was something that was more had more of a sense of cohesion across the entire nation, a sense of, as I've said, common identity. All right, so what happened? The Jeffersonian Republicans did better at building these kind of networks over time. Eventually, the Federalists died out, were replaced by another party, the Whig Party, and then around the time of the Civil War, there was another replacement with the Republican Party, and the Democratic Republicans evolved into the Democrats. So now, jumping forward in our time, we have two political parties, the Republicans and Democrats, that have been in power for a long time. And the problem and the reason that people are disillusioned with the two-party system or dissatisfied and agitating for a change is that those two parties have become so entrenched that they've ceased to be responsive to voters in the way voters expect. Because there's only two parties and they have control of things like the voting process and ballot access and how only the parties can get on the ballot easily. All the kind of stuff I've been talking about for the last several months in the presidential election, it has made it harder for voters to have a way of escaping the two parties. They've been captives to the two-party system, and the parties have turned more and more to their corporate donors to keep, the money coming for campaign propaganda and trying to demonize the other side in order to maintain votes, even though people are not too happy with parties. At least they can get them to hate the other party even more. So how do we change this dynamic? now that the parties are entrenched and control the process? Well, the only way that I can see to do this, all right, either we're trying to force a realignment in one or both of the major parties, that is, dissolving the coalition that's backing the party and replacing it with a new coalition that gives the whole party a different perspective, or replacing one of the current parties with a different party, like a minor party that shows its capability of growing, or another independent candidate who's able to build a big movement that can turn into a party. We back candidates like that. We back parties like that. We can back changes in our voting methods to make the system more open and competitive. I've talked about preferential voting, like ranked choice voting and star voting. I've talked about open primaries that allow independents to come in and choose who gets to be the nominees in the general election, and not just limit it to the party loyalists and diehards. This is the way to break open the party system. You look at what's going on in your particular state as far as independent candidates, minor party candidates, and electoral reform movements, and ask yourself which of those in your situation seems to be the most fruitful that you can participate in. Or if there's nothing there, maybe you can get something started. Or if not, you can help the movement in some other state, maybe making a donation or in some other way offering to volunteer your time. Well, that's it for this episode. What I wanted to do is get across that the two-party system is built upon an independently elected presidency that represents the whole nation, that those two parties have become entrenched, and the way to get over this is you're not going to get rid of the presidency because that requires a major constitutional amendment, but you can find ways to make the system more open and competitive so that the fault lines within those two major parties can be exploited to change the system, make it more responsive to voters, and then move forward from that point, hopefully. So this is Political Dharma. I'm Alan Zundel. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for your support, your subscribes, your likes, your comments, your donations. If you want to help support this, please go to politicaldharma.com to make a one-time donation, or you can become a Patreon member. And I'm trying to work towards giving exclusive benefits to my subscribers there, like early access to videos and things like that. That's about it for this episode. I will be back on the weekend with an update on the campaigns, both the presidential campaign focusing on minor party candidates and the campaigns for changes in voting systems. And when the election's over, I'll be doing an analysis of all this stuff and what situation it leaves us in so that we can decide how to move forward into the future. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you come back. Bye.